Champagne flutes clinked like breaking glass. Claire stood by the weeping ice sculpture, nursing a lukewarm club soda, entirely invisible, until Thomas Wright, a man whose net worth could buy the building, watched her discreetly wipe a smear of cheap lipstick off her teeth. He didn't offer a drink. He offered an exit. Synthetic silk trapped the heat against the back of Claire's neck. The dress, a thrifted emerald slip that had looked vaguely elegant under the harsh fluorescent lights of the consignment shop, now felt like a cheap costume. It clung to her ribs, static-charged and suffocating. Around her, the ballroom hummed with the aggressive energy of networking. The air was thick, heavy with the conflicting smells of roasted duck, expensive ambergris perfumes, and the sharp, metallic ozone radiating from a massive swan ice sculpture melting onto a silver tray. Claire dug her thumbnail into the pad of her index finger, a sharp, grounding pinch. She checked the cracked screen of her phone. 9:14 p.m. Mrs. Higgins charged $15 an hour to watch Toby. After 9 o'clock, the rate bumped to 20. Every minute Claire stood in this cavernous, gilded room, a quiet panic tabulated the math in her head. $5, $10, a carton of milk, a box of winter boots. She shouldn't have come. Richard, a mid-level logistics manager she had been seeing for a tepid 3 weeks, had promised a night of effortless glamour. "Just stand there and look pretty," he had said, clapping her on the shoulder before immediately abandoning her near the catering entrance to corner a vice president. She took a sip of her club soda. The ice had melted, leaving a flat, alkaline taste on her tongue. Across the room, partially obscured by a massive, shedding ficus plant that smelled faintly of damp potting soil, Thomas Wright leaned against a marble pillar. He hated the ficus. He hated the marble. He hated the fact that he technically owned the floorboards beneath the polished Italian leather of his shoes. The watch on his left wrist, a platinum complication that cost more than most people's homes, felt like a manacle. It slid down his forearm, heavy and cold. Thomas wasn't looking at the vice presidents or the socialites laughing with their heads thrown back, flashing veneer-perfect teeth. He was looking at the woman by the melting swan. She looked seasick, not poetically lost, not mysteriously aloof, just nauseous. He watched her shift her weight. Her left ankle wobbled in a black pump that was clearly a half size too large. She curled her toes to keep it on. The micro-expression of pure, unadulterated discomfort on her face was the most honest thing Thomas had seen all evening. He took a slow breath. The air over here smelled like floor wax and stale scotch. He was holding a glass of it, the liquid warming against his palm, the condensation dripping down to freeze his knuckles. He hadn't taken a sip in 40 minutes. A waiter in a stiff white jacket glided past Claire, extending a silver platter. She hesitated, then took a small, dark square on a toasted point. Thomas knew those canapes. Smoked salmon, cream cheese, and capers. Claire bit into it. Thomas saw her jaw stop working almost immediately. The brine and the metallic tang of the fish hit the back of her throat. She didn't gracefully swallow it. She didn't pretend it was a delicacy. Panic flared in her brown eyes. She hastily grabbed a cocktail napkin, turned her back to the room, and spat it out with a violent, ungraceful cough. Thomas snorted. It was an ugly, sudden sound that scraped against the back of his throat. Claire froze. She slowly turned her head, the crumpled napkin clutched in her fist like contraband. A stray fiber of cheap white paper clung to her lower lip. Her eyes met his through the gaps in the ficus leaves. She didn't blush. She didn't look away coyly. She just looked caught and intensely, utterly tired. the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that Thomas recognized from the mirror every morning. He felt a strange, cynical urge to poke at that exhaustion, to see if it was real, or just another layer of the evening's performance. Thomas set his untouched scotch on the edge of a passing busboy's tray. The heavy crystal clicked sharply against the metal. He pushed away from the marble pillar. His suit, bespoke charcoal wool that draped perfectly over his shoulders, felt suddenly heavy. He walked toward her. His leather soles snapped against the mahogany floor, a steady rhythmic approach that made the surrounding crowd unconsciously part for him. They recognized the cut of the suit, the confident gait. They smelled the money. Claire watched him come. Her stomach tightened, a sour knot forming beneath the tight band of her dress. She quickly wiped the back of her hand across her mouth, dislodging the napkin fuzz. Great, she thought. Now I'm the weird girl who spits out free food, and a guy who looks like a hedge fund manager is coming to point it out. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough that she could smell the clean, sharp scent of his soap. Cedar and something sharp, like crushed pine needles, cutting through the heavy room. They put capers in the salmon, Thomas said. His voice was gravelly, quieter than she expected. There was no slick charm in it, just a flat statement of fact. Claire blinked. She tightened her grip on her warm club soda. I hate capers. They taste like batteries. A muscle in Thomas's jaw twitched. Not a smile exactly, but the ghost of one. Then why did you eat it? Because standing here doing nothing makes me look pathetic, she said, the words slipping out before her internal filter could catch them. She clamped her mouth shut, her fingernails biting harder into her palm. She expected him to laugh, to patronize her. Instead, Thomas looked at the melting ice swan. You don't look pathetic, he murmured, his gaze tracing a rivulet of water running down the swan's neck. You look like you're calculating exactly how many minutes you have to endure before it's socially acceptable to call a cab. Claire felt her throat tighten. The accuracy of his assessment was jarring, stripping away the thin veneer of belonging she had tried to paste over herself all night. Before she could form a defensive reply, her phone vibrated against her hip. The cracked screen lit up. A text from Mrs. Higgins. Toby threw up his juice. Still crying. Might need to put on a movie. Claire's shoulders slumped. The carefully constructed posture she'd maintained for Richard dissolved. She rubbed her forehead, smudging the cheap foundation she had painstakingly applied 2 hours ago. The babysitter meter in her head didn't just tick anymore. It hammered. I have to go, she whispered, mostly to herself. She scanned the crowd. Richard was 3 clusters of people deep, laughing loudly with his head thrown back, holding a fresh martini. He was her ride. She had $18 in her checking account and a credit card she treated like a live grenade. A taxi to the suburbs was easily $40. Thomas tracked her line of sight. He saw the mid-level suit with the overly enthusiastic laugh. He looked back at Claire, noting the white-knuckled grip on her phone, the slight tremor in her hands. He didn't pull out his wallet. He didn't offer a grand cinematic rescue. He knew how charity felt to people who were drowning. It felt like a stone. The front entrance is jammed, Thomas said, his voice flat and neutral. There's a queue for the valet that will take 30 minutes. But if you walk through those double doors over there, he pointed to a set of padded leather doors matching the walls, nearly invisible. It leads to the service corridor. It's quiet, and it spits you out right next to the employee bus stop. Cabs idle there. It's faster. Claire looked at the doors, then back at him. His eyes were pale blue, washed out under the lights and guarded. There was no predatory gleam, no expectation. just a factual exchange of logistics. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because the bass from the string quartet's amp is giving me a migraine," Thomas lied smoothly, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "And if I walk through those doors alone, someone will follow me to pitch a startup. If I walk with you, they'll assume I'm occupied." It was a transaction. She could handle a transaction. "Fine," Claire said. She set her warm club soda down next to the melting swan. "Lead the way." They moved together, slipping through the heavy leather doors just as a burst of applause erupted from the main floor. The immediate drop in decibels hit Claire like a physical weight being lifted off her chest. The service hallway was starkly different from the ballroom. The walls were cinder block painted a sterile, institutional green. The air smelled of industrial bleach, old onions, and the sharp tang of Freon from the massive walk-in refrigerators humming violently to their left. The floor was scuffed linoleum. It was the most beautiful place Claire had seen all night. She stopped walking, leaning against the cold cinder block wall, and let out a long, ragged exhale. Without thinking, she reached down and unbuckled the strap of her left pump, sliding her heel out. The skin over her Achilles tendon was rubbed raw, a brilliant, angry red against her pale ankle. She hissed through her teeth as the cool air hit the blister. Thomas stood a few feet away, his hands buried deep in his trouser pockets. He watched her peel off the other shoe. Most women in his orbit would rather die than stand barefoot on a sticky linoleum floor in a service corridor. Claire didn't even look at the floor. She just closed her eyes and tilted her head back against the painted bricks. "Better?" he asked. "I think I might live," she mumbled, keeping her eyes closed. "Though my son might disagree when I get home. He's sick. My sitter is struggling." She opened her eyes, immediately regretting the overshare. "Sorry, you don't care about that. Startup pitches and all." Thomas looked down at his own shoes. The polished leather suddenly looked ridiculous in the harsh, flickering, fluorescent light of the hallway. "I don't mind," he said quietly. "It's a better pitch than most I hear." He walked over to a stack of overturned plastic milk crates stacked near the catering prep station. He pulled one down, the plastic scraping loudly against the linoleum. He set it down near her and gestured to it. Claire hesitated, then sank onto the crate. The plastic grid bit into her thighs through the thin silk of her dress, but the relief in her arches was intoxicating. Thomas didn't stand over her. He walked to the opposite wall, right next to the humming refrigerator, and slid down the cinder blocks until he was sitting on the floor. His charcoal suit bunched around his knees. He didn't care about the dirt. "So," Thomas said, resting his forearms on his knees, looking across the narrow hallway at her. "He ditched you." Claire let out a short, humorless laugh. "Richard? Yeah. I think I served my purpose as arm candy for the first 20 minutes. Once he got past the velvet rope, I became a liability." She traced a groove in the plastic crate with her fingernail. "I shouldn't have come. I can't afford the babysitter. I can't afford the cab home. And I definitely couldn't afford this dress, which, by the way, feels like it's made of recycled fishing line." Thomas didn't offer pity. "Then why did you?" "Because," Claire looked up, her expression hardening, "for one night I wanted to remember what it felt like to not be just a mother, or a debt, or a problem to solve. I wanted to wear a dress and stand in a beautiful room." She gestured toward the leather doors. "Turns out the room is full of fake people. The dress hurts, and the salmon has capers." Thomas stared at her. The silence stretched, filled only by the aggressive, rattling hum of the refrigerator compressor. He felt a tight, cynical knot in his chest loosen, just a fraction. You're right, Thomas said softly. The people are fake, and the caterer is overpriced garbage. I should know. I signed the checks for all of it. Claire froze. Her hands stopped moving on the plastic crate. She stared at the man sitting on the dirty floor across from her, taking in the bespoke suit, the expensive watch, the casual authority he carried even while slouched against a wall. You're Thomas Wright, she breathed, the realization washing over her like cold water. Thomas braced himself for the shift. He waited for the widening of the eyes, the sudden deference, the calculation that always followed when people realized who he was. Claire just stared at him for a long, heavy moment. Then, she looked down at her raw, blistered heels and back up at him. You need to fire your event planner, she said flatly. Thomas let out a bark of a laugh, genuine and loud, echoing off the cinder blocks. Concrete blocks absorbed the sound of his laugh. Claire watched his chest heave once, a sharp exhalation that seemed to knock the corporate stiffness right out of his shoulders. For a second, he didn't look like a man who owned skyscrapers. He looked like a tired guy sitting on a dirty floor. I'll pass the note along to catering, Thomas said, wiping a trace of moisture from the corner of his eye. He pushed himself up from the linoleum, his joints popping faintly in the echoing hallway. He brushed a streak of gray dust off the thigh of his trousers. Come on, the loading dock is this way. Claire grabbed her shoes by the straps, the cheap synthetic leather digging into her palm. She padded after him in her bare feet. The linoleum was freezing, sapping the remaining warmth from her soles. But she welcomed the sting. It kept her anchored. She followed the broad, charcoal-clad line of his shoulders past a row of stacked metal folding chairs and a bin overflowing with crushed cardboard boxes. The hallway smelled aggressively of decaying florist foam and stale coffee grounds. He pushed open a heavy, dented steel fire door. Late autumn air hit them like a physical blow. It was damp, carrying the sharp, metallic threat of impending rain and the heavy scent of diesel exhaust. The alleyway was dark, illuminated only by a caged yellow security bulb that buzzed like an angry hornet. Thomas didn't scan the street for a cab. He raised a hand toward a massive black SUV idling aggressively next to a dumpster. The vehicle looked armored, its paint so dark and polished it seemed to swallow the dim light. No, Claire said immediately, stopping dead on the concrete loading ramp. The cold bit into her toes. Absolutely not. Thomas paused, looking back at her over his shoulder. The yellow light cast harsh skeletal shadows across his cheekbones. A cab to the outer suburbs at this hour is $40 before the tip, assuming you can even flag one down in the financial district. My driver is already paid for the night. He's reading a paperback and drinking bad coffee. It's a sunk cost. I don't care about your sunk costs. I don't know you. Claire crossed her arms over her chest. The thin silk of her dress offered zero protection against the wind. She was shivering, her teeth clamped together so hard her jaw ached, but she stood her ground. You don't just get into a blacked-out car with a billionaire you met in a hallway. Fair point, Thomas conceded. He didn't sound offended. He sounded analytical. He stepped back from the vehicle, leaving a wide berth between himself and the passenger door. I'll ride in the front with Sam. You take the back. There's a partition. You can roll the window down. If I do anything remotely unsettling, scream, jump out at a red light, or hit me with one of those shoes. They look sharp. Claire stared at the idling behemoth. Her phone vibrated again against her hip. A phantom sympathetic ache flared in her chest. Toby was crying. She knew the sound of his sick cry. It was thin, high-pitched, and entirely heartbreaking. Mrs. Higgins was likely losing her temper. Every second Claire stood in this alley was another took on the babysitter's meter. Another moment her son was miserable. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford tonight. "If you talk to me during this ride," Claire said, her voice shaking slightly from the cold, "I will stab you with the heel." "Understood," Thomas said flatly. He opened the heavy rear door. The interior smelled of rich, unblemished leather and ozone from the climate control. Claire climbed in, her bare feet sinking into floor mats that felt thicker than her living room rug. She pulled her knees together, painfully aware of the damp concrete dust clinging to her soles. Terrified she was going to stain the pristine upholstery. Thomas shut the door with a solid vault-like thud that instantly severed the noise of the city. He walked around the front and slid into the passenger seat. The driver, an older man with a thick neck and tired eyes, didn't ask questions. He just put the car in gear. The SUV merged into the slick, wet streets. Inside, the silence was absolute. The acoustic glass blocked out the sirens, the honking, the friction of the tires. It felt like riding in a sensory deprivation tank. Claire huddled in the corner of the massive back seat. The heated leather began to thaw the ice in her bones. But the warmth only made the cheap synthetic fabric of her dress feel stickier. She kept her eyes glued to the window, watching the glittering, monolithic towers of the city center bleed into the squat, gray commercial buildings of the industrial district. Through the tinted glass of the partition, she could see the back of Thomas's head. He was scrolling through a tablet, the bluish light reflecting off the windshield. He hadn't turned around once. He hadn't tried to make small talk. He was honoring the transaction exactly as negotiated. It infuriated her. She wanted him to be arrogant. She wanted him to make a condescending remark so she could justify the deep, class-based resentment boiling in her gut. Instead, he was just a guy, respecting a boundary. It forced her to sit entirely with her own mess. Her phone screen lit up. "Total for tonight is $75, Mrs. Higgins had texted. "Please hurry." Claire closed her eyes, resting her forehead against the cool glass of the window. $75. She mentally subtracted it from the anemic number in her checking account. She would have to skip the grocery run tomorrow and rely on the frozen chicken and rice in the back of the freezers until Thursday. She mentally inventoried her pantry, counting cans of beans and half-empty boxes of cereal. Her heart beating a steady, anxious rhythm against her ribs. The transition from the city to her neighborhood was stark. The smooth asphalt gave way to potholed roads that made even the massive SUV shudder slightly. The street lights here weren't bright halogen. They were dying sodium bulbs casting a sickly orange pallor over chain-link fences and tightly packed, sagging apartment buildings. "Turn left at the next light," Claire suddenly spoke, her voice cracking the heavy silence. "It's the brick building at the end of the cul-de-sac, the one with the broken awning." Up front, Thomas simply tapped the driver's shoulder and pointed. He didn't look out the window at the cracked sidewalks or the overflowing dumpsters. He didn't play the part of the wealthy tourist examining poverty. He kept his eyes on his tablet. The SUV slowed, its headlights sweeping over the peeling paint of the lobby doors. It came to a smooth, silent stop. "Thank you," Claire said stiffly. She fumbled for the door handle, desperate to escape the suffocating luxury of the cabin. She pushed the door open, bracing herself for the cold. As she swung her legs out, her phone slipped from her lap, sliding silently into the dark crevice between the seat and the door. Gravel crunched beneath her bare feet. Claire ignored the sharp sting, her eyes fixed on the glass lobby doors. Mrs. Higgins was standing just inside, pacing in front of the bank of brass mailboxes, a bundle of blankets hitched aggressively on her hip. Even through the smudged glass, Claire could see the exhausted, tight-lipped grimace on the older woman's face. Claire slammed the car door shut with her hip and jogged toward the building, completely forgetting her shoes on the floorboard of the SUV. "I'm so sorry," Claire gasped, yanking the heavy metal handle. The door shrieked in protest, the hinges grinding. The lobby smelled distinctly of boiled cabbage and the harsh chemical tang of cheap floor cleaner. Mrs. Higgins didn't offer a greeting. She thrust the squirming bundle forward. He threw up twice. "I gave him the infant Tylenol 20 minutes ago, but the fever isn't breaking. I have to get home, Claire. My husband works the early shift." I know. I'm sorry," Claire murmured, taking her son. Toby was a furnace. His small body radiated an alarming dry heat. He whined, a weak, raspy sound, and buried his clammy face into the curve of Claire's neck. His pajamas smelled sharply of sour milk and sweat. Claire instinctively bounced on her heels, a rhythmic, soothing motion, while simultaneously digging her free hand into the tiny beaded clutch Richard had insisted she carry. Her fingers scraped against a tube of lipstick, a single key, and the folded wad of cash she had prepared. She pulled the bills out. 2 20s, 3 10s, a 5. Exactly $75. She held it out. Mrs. Higgins snatched the money. She didn't count it. She just shoved it into her oversized purse. "He needs fluids. Don't let him sleep through the night without drinking." Without another word, she pushed past Claire, marching out into the damp night. Claire let out a long, shuddering breath, squeezing her eyes shut. She pressed her cheek against Toby's damp, fine hair. "I've got you, buddy," she whispered into the dark lobby. "Mom's got you." "You left these." The voice came from right behind her, low and gravelly. Claire spun around, her heart vaulting into her throat. Thomas was standing inside the lobby. He must have caught the door before it swung shut behind the babysitter. He looked entirely out of place, an expensive, tailored ghost haunting a linoleum corridor. In his right hand, he held her cheap black pumps. In his left, her cracked phone. "It slid under the seat," Thomas said, offering the phone first. Claire stared at him. The adrenaline of the sudden scare mixed violently with the sheer exhaustion of the evening. She felt a flush of hot, prickly shame crawling up her neck. She didn't want him in here. She didn't want him to see the peeling yellow wallpaper, or smell the cabbage, or witness the pathetic, chaotic reality of her life. She snatched the phone from his hand, her knuckles brushing against his knuckles. His skin was warm. Hers was freezing. "Thanks," she clipped, shifting Toby higher on her shoulder. The baby let out a pathetic, wet cough, drooling a mixture of saliva and remnants of medicine onto the silk strap of her dress. Thomas looked at the child. His pale blue eyes tracked the erratic rise and fall of the boy's chest. He didn't recoil from the smell or the mess. His expression was impossible to read, neither pity nor disgust, just a quiet, intense observation. He placed the shoes gently on top of the mailboxes. They landed with a hollow clack. "He's burning up," Thomas observed, his voice stripped of the corporate detachment he had used in the car. "I know," Claire snapped. The defensive wall slammed down hard, fortified by panic and poverty. "I have it handled. Thank you for the ride. You can go back to your ivory tower now." Thomas didn't flinch at the venom. He just looked at her. Really looked at her. He saw the way her arms were trembling under the weight of the toddler, the way the cheap green dress was stained, the way her bare feet were shivering on the cold tile. "I'm not trying to fix you," Thomas said, his words dropping into the quiet lobby like stones in a well. The raw honesty of the statement knocked the wind out of her anger. Claire blinked, tightening her grip on Toby. "Good," she managed to whisper, her voice cracking. "Because I can't afford your rates." A tiny, bitter smile touched the corner of Thomas's mouth. He took a step backward toward the heavy metal door. "Nobody can." He pushed the door open, the damp air rushing back into the stagnant lobby. He paused on the threshold, framed by the yellow street lamp outside. "Capers really do taste like batteries," he said quietly. Then he let the door swing shut, the heavy latch clicking into place. Claire stood alone under the flickering fluorescent light, the smell of cabbage and cedar lingering in the air. She listened to the crunch of his shoes on the gravel, followed by the quiet, powerful hum of the SUV pulling away into the night. She pressed her face into her son's shoulder, inhaling the sour smell of sickness, and for the first time all night, she cried. Not out of sadness, but from the terrifying, disarming relief of having been completely, undeniably seen. Dust motes drifted lazily through the sharp, angular slats of sunlight cutting across the kitchen floor. Claire sat perfectly still on a mismatched wooden chair, listening. From the bedroom down the narrow hall, a steady rhythmic breathing echoed off the peeling wallpaper. Toby was asleep. The terrifying dry heat that had radiated from his skin for hours had finally broken into a cold, clammy sweat around 4 a.m, leaving a damp silhouette on his faded dinosaur sheets. She brought a chipped ceramic mug to her lips. The instant coffee was tepid, tasting strongly of tap water and burnt chicory, but she drank it anyway. She needed the harsh caffeine to scrape together the energy to call the diner and lie to her manager about having the stomach flu so she wouldn't lose her weekend shifts entirely. Over by the front door, the emerald green dress lay in a crumpled heap next to the cheap black pumps. In the unforgiving daylight, the synthetic silk looked absurd, like a discarded Halloween costume. She stared at the shoes. The memory of the icy service hallway, the biting concrete of the loading dock, and the pristine, ozone-scented leather of the SUV interior played behind her tired eyes like a muted, surreal film. Thomas Wright. She rubbed her thumb over the sore, raised blisters on her heels, a sharp hiss escaping her teeth. She hadn't let herself process the sheer absurdity of the night. A man who bought and sold pharmaceutical companies for sport had sat on a dirty cinder block floor with her. He hadn't tried to save her. He hadn't treated her like a wounded bird. He had just acknowledged the absolute, unvarnished mess of her reality, without blinking or offering a platitude. A sharp metallic buzz shattered the quiet of the apartment. Claire jumped, coffee sloshing over the rim of the mug and scalding her knuckles. She swore softly, wiping her hand on her fleece sweatpants as she hurried to the wall intercom. She pressed the yellowed plastic button, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs. "Yeah," she rasped, her voice thick from exhaustion. "Delivery for Claire." A distorted, tinny voice crackled through the ancient speaker. "Need a signature." Panic, immediate and icy, spiked in her chest. Deliveries meant bills. Deliveries meant collection notices or certified letters from the property management company threatening eviction over the noise complaints Mrs. Higgins generated when Toby cried too loud. "Leave it by the mailboxes," she instructed, her throat tight. "Requires a physical signature, ma'am. I'm coming up." Claire stood by the door, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, shivering despite the morning heat baking the small apartment. 2 minutes later, a heavy knock rattled the cheap veneer of her front door. She unbolted the deadbolt and cracked the door open a fraction of an inch, keeping the heavy brass chain engaged. A bored-looking man in a brown uniform stood in the hallway, holding a sleek, unbranded cardboard box and an electronic clipboard. He didn't look like a process server. He just looked tired, chewing on a piece of gum. "Sign here," he muttered, shoving the digital screen through the gap in the door. Claire scribbled an illegible loop with her index finger, undid the chain, and pulled the heavy box inside. The delivery man turned on his heel and was gone before she even closed the door. She carried the box to the kitchen counter, pushing aside a stack of final notice utility bills to make room. It was surprisingly heavy, sealed with reinforced nylon packing tape. She grabbed a serrated steak knife from the plastic drying rack and sliced through the adhesive. The cardboard parted with a satisfying tearing rip. Inside, nestled in a bed of recyclable brown paper coils, were no grand cinematic gestures. No diamond necklaces, no keys to a penthouse apartment. Claire let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She reached in and pulled out a tall, insulated medical bag. Unzipping it, she found 4 large bottles of premium, unflavored pediatric electrolyte solution, a box of high-end children's fever suppositories, and a clinical-grade infrared ear thermometer. Underneath the medical supplies sat a small square tin. She pried the metal lid off. It was packed tight with thick medical-grade hydrocolloid blister bandages. It was an arsenal for survival. It was exactly what she needed, chosen by someone who had actually paid attention. At the very bottom of the box lay a heavy cream-colored envelope. Her name was written on the front in sharp, architectural black ink. Claire wiped her hands on her sweatpants again, suddenly self-conscious of the coffee stains on her fingers, and tore the envelope open. A thick cardstock square slid into her palm. The capers were a symptom of a larger problem. The catering company has been fired. Claire let out a short, wet laugh, the sound echoing strangely in the quiet kitchen. She flipped the card over. "You refused to pretend you belonged in a room full of people faking their own importance. I don't need yes men. I need people who can see the structural flaws and aren't afraid to point them out. There is a junior logistics position opening in my supply chain division on Monday. It pays enough that you won't need to count the minutes on a babysitter's clock. Call the number below by Friday. Don't wear the green dress. T.W." Below his initials was a direct 10-digit phone number. Claire stared at the card. The edges of the heavy paper blurred as hot tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them back violently. She wasn't going to cry. Not today. She looked at the heavy bottles of electrolytes. She looked at the expensive tin of bandages. Then she looked over at the trash can by the front door. Walking slowly across the kitchen floor, favoring her raw heels, Claire reached down and picked up the emerald green dress. She didn't hold it with reverence. She bunched the cheap synthetic fabric into a tight, ugly ball, marched over to the under-sink cabinet, and shoved it deep into the garbage bag, burying it under wet coffee grounds and empty cans of black beans. She walked back to the kitchen counter. The air in the apartment didn't smell like boiled cabbage or despair anymore. It smelled like the sharp, clean scent of black ink on heavy paper. Claire picked up her phone, her thumb brushing over the spiderweb cracks in the glass screen. She tapped the keypad icon. She didn't dial the diner to beg her manager for a sick day. Instead, she slowly, deliberately punched in the 10-digit number from the card. The line clicked, buzzing with a heavy, static-free connection. Claire took a deep breath, the grit of the morning fading, replaced by a terrifying electric clarity. For the first time in years, she wasn't bracing for a blow. She was stepping up to the plate. The ringing stopped. A professional, clipped voice answered. "Executive office, how may I direct your call?" Claire stood up straight, ignoring the sting in her feet. "Hi," she said, her voice steady and clear. "This is Claire. Tell Thomas I need to know the dress code. Real power isn't about grand rescues. It's about seeing someone completely and giving them the tools to stand on their own." If Claire's unapologetic grit and Thomas's quiet, practical observation struck a chord with you, make sure to hit that like button. Share this video with a friend who appreciates a story grounded in raw, messy reality. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our next deeply human drama. Leave a comment below. Would you have made the call?